The terrain sloped gently upward as Idris and his crew pulled the wagons through the rugged landscape. The clear blue sky overhead did much to ease the tension from the encounter in the ruins behind them. Ahead, the land seemed to change. Slowly, the grayish-brown and dark green of the blight gave way to bare earth. Yarrick pointed towards the distance in front of them. "Captain Kaan, you might want to have a look at that." Idris jumped onto the wagon to get a better view, and when he strained his eyes he could see, far in the distance between them and the giant tree, what appeared to be a thin, dark line stretching across the land like an ink stroke on a canvas. "I see it, Yarrick," Idris replied. "What is it?" a crew member murmured, squinting against the sun. "It's a break in the land," Idris said as he jumped down from the wagon. "Looks like it runs straight across the island, but don't worry. We'll figure out how to cross it as we get closer," he added, keeping his voice confident. As they approached, the enormity of the chasm became clear. What had seemed like a shallow crack from afar revealed itself as a yawning maw, wide and deep, cutting through the terrain like a blade. The edges were jagged and rough, as if the earth had been violently wrenched apart by some great force. "Let's slow down a bit," Idris ordered. "We should be clear of the blight, but I don't want any nasty surprises." The group slowed their pace, taking their time to approach the chasm. The crew pulling and pushing the wagons appreciated the slower pace, and soon idle banter could be heard among them. "Captain," Yarrick called out, his voice tight with unease. This wasn't here before. I checked the charts, it's not on any of them." Idris nodded, his expression grim. "No, it wasn't. Ariki spoke of the volcano shaking the islands a few weeks ago. It may be that it did more than just spook the wildlife." He cast a glance back toward the ruins they had come from. It might have broken the island and stirred up the blight as well. The crew exchanged uneasy glances at his words. As they drew closer to the chasm, they saw it stretched in both directions, disappearing into the horizon where the land curved. There was no obvious way across. No natural bridge or narrow passage where they could leap to the other side. The rocky walls of the chasm were sheer and unforgiving, slick with moisture from some unseen source deep below. "We need to find a way across," Idris said, leaning over the edge to peer into the abyss. "If this chasm splits the island in two, we might have to get creative." He turned to the crew. "Scout it out," he ordered. "See if there's a place we can cross. Anything that looks stable." A few of the crew moved along the edge of the chasm, carefully testing the ground with each step. They walked a good distance in both directions, checking for any natural crossings, but every few moments, one would shake their head in frustration. "Nothing," a scout finally reported, returning to Idris. "It goes on forever. No way to cross from here." Idris felt a sinking sensation in his chest. Was the island breaking apart? Was this some new manifestation of the blight or something else entirely? He turned his gaze back to the crew, their eyes on him, waiting for a decision. "Building a bridge might be our best bet," he mused, "but we're too close to the blight here. The wood wouldn't hold. Rot would set in before we even made it halfway." Several crew members nodded in agreement. The blight's corruption was unpredictable, its effects spreading like a sickness through anything it touched. They needed a different solution. Idris considered their options for a moment, then pulled a weathered coin from his pocket. The metal gleamed in the sunlight, its surface worn smooth by years of use. He turned it over in his fingers, feeling the familiar weight. "Left or right?" he asked, holding the coin up for the crew to see. A murmur ran through the group as they debated their choices. Both directions seemed equally uncertain, the chasm stretching endlessly either way. There was no clear sign, no indication of which path might lead them to safety. With a shrug, Idris flipped the coin high into the air. It spun, catching the sunlight before landing back in his palm. He glanced down at the result, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Right it is," he announced, tucking the coin back into his pocket. "We'll head to the right. Maybe we'll find a narrowing in the chasm or a better place to cross." They gathered their gear and set off along the edge of the chasm, moving in a single file. The air was fresh and clear, the weather unusually pleasant for this time of year. With a deep breath, he steeled himself and pressed on, leading his crew along the edge of the abyss, hoping that their choice would lead them to the giant tree. The chasm stretched before them like a gaping wound in the earth, but after a grueling trek along its edge, they finally stumbled upon a more favorable location. Here the chasm seemed to narrow slightly, its jagged edges less sheer. The ground was firmer, less treacherous, and a few sturdy trees jutted out from the earth, offering an anchor for a makeshift bridge. The captain's keen eye assessed the spot, a rare stroke of fortune on this accursed island. "This will do," Idris murmured, voice tired from the trek. "Set up here. We've got a bridge to build." Yarrick wiped the sweat from his brow and glanced at the trees. "A bridge, huh? You think those trees will hold? That's a long way down if they don't." Idris shot him a look, a flicker of amusement creeping through his exhaustion. "If they don't hold, Yarrick, you can fly across on your optimism." Yarrick let out a tired chuckle, shaking his head. "Aye, Captain. I'll save the flying for the birds." As they spoke, Ilara the carpenter came up to Idris, eyeing the chasm with a frown. "If we do this right, it'll hold. But we're going to need every bit of rope and timber we can get our hands on." Idris nodded, looking around at his weary crew. "We'll make it work. Start cutting the trees and fashion the beams. We're not staying on this side of the chasm any longer than we need to." Ilara led a group into the nearby woods to search for timber. The rest of the group sat down, glad for the rest. After a while, Ilara's team emerged, carrying newly fashioned beams on their shoulders. Upon closer inspection, Idris noticed it wasn't ordinary wood. This was something else entirely. The wood was darker, denser, with an unnatural weight and a curious sheen, almost metallic. Ilara tapped one of the beam against a rock, and the wood rang like a struck bell. "Strong stuff," she said, a note of wonder in her voice. "Unusually strong." Idris paused at the sound, his eyes narrowing as he watched Ilara tap the beam again. The sharp, ringing note reverberated through the air, unsettling in its clarity. He stepped closer, running a hand over the smooth surface of the wood, his fingers tracing the grain. "Too strong," he muttered under his breath, a faint unease prickling at the back of his mind. The timber had been cut from trees not far from the blighted terrain, yet it felt more solid, more unnatural than it should. "It'll hold," he said aloud, keeping his voice steady. But inwardly, a quiet voice warned him that this island was unfamiliar materials and care need to be taken. They wasted no time. The crew, under Ilara's careful supervision, set to work. Using ropes and makeshift pulleys, they began to construct a bridge capable of bearing their heavy wagons. Each plank was laid with caution, each knot tied with the utmost care. The wood, strong as iron, seemed to bend to their will, and as the hours passed, a sturdy bridge began to take shape. By the time the final plank was set and the last knot secured, the sky had begun to change. The blistering midday sun had softened, giving way to a cloudy afternoon, a welcome reprieve from the relentless heat. Yarrick was the first to step onto the bridge, testing it with a hesitant press of his boot. "Feels steady enough," he muttered, though his eyes were glued to the dizzying drop below. "Stop tempting fate, Yarrick," Ilara quipped, gripping one of the wagon handles. "If it holds you, it'll hold anything." The bridge groaned under the weight of the wagons, but the ropes and timber held firm. As each step carried them further across the yawning chasm, a collective breath was held, only to be released once they reached the other side. "That's one less problem," Idris said, letting out a long breath, his eyes scanning the treacherous chasm behind them. "Good work, everyone." Ilara nodded, wiping the sweat from her forehead. "And here I thought we'd be building our graves, not a bridge." Yarrick chuckled, though his voice was still tense. "Let's just hope it doesn't fall apart on the way back." "Who said anything about going back?" Idris replied with a grin, though the weariness in his eyes betrayed the toll of the journey. "We keep moving forward." Their destination remained distant, shrouded in the thickening gloom of early evening. Idris, sensing the weariness settling into his crew's bones, called for camp. Without a word, they set to work, well practiced in the routine of pitching their temporary homes. Tents rose quickly, and soon a small fire flickered in the cooling air, casting long shadows that danced with the deepening twilight. As the first stars pricked the velvety darkness overhead, the stillness of the evening was shattered by a loud squawk, followed by an eerie sequence of whistles and a strange, lilting melody. The sound came from the trees, piercing the calm. A sudden burst of vibrant plumage cut through the shadows. A parrot, gliding from the canopy with feathers of emerald green and sapphire blue, its colors almost too brilliant for the muted landscape around it. The bird's movement was less than graceful, hopping from branch to branch before fluttering down to the ground. It landed directly in front of Idris, cocking its head with an inquisitive gleam in its eye. an intelligence that seemed almost too knowing for a simple forest creature. Idris, bemused, extended a cautious hand. With a quick flurry of wings, the parrot hopped onto his arm, nipping playfully at his sleeve, its squawks growing louder as though greeting him or warning him. "Well, aren't you a lively one?" Idris said with a grin, though a flicker of wariness glimmered in his eyes. The bird responded with another squawk, then whistled a tune that sent a collective shiver through the camp. It was hauntingly familiar, a melody from some distant, half-remembered memory. The melody hung in the air, wrapping around the crew like a chill wind. Conversations faltered as the strange tune dug into their senses, familiar yet elusive, as if plucked from a dream half-forgotten. Idris frowned, trying to place it, but the harder he tried, the more it slipped from his grasp. The parrot, perched on his arm, cocked its head again, its beady eyes glittering with mischief. Or was it something else? The bird seemed to know more than it let on. "Anyone else hearing this?" Yarrick muttered, his voice low as he glanced warily at the bird. "That's no regular song. It's old," Ilara said quietly, her brow furrowed as she stoked the fire. "I've heard something like it before. Long ago. But I can't place it." Idris remained silent, watching the parrot closely. It ruffled its feathers, the bright colors shimmering in the firelight, and whistled again. This time the tune more fragmented, more erratic. It hopped along his arm, nipping at his sleeve as if urging him to listen. "Why do I feel like this thing's trying to tell us something?" Idris murmured, his voice barely audible. Squawk. Idris flinched at the sudden ear-piercing screech, the parrot's shrill demand ringing in his ears. The bird flapped its wings wildly, feathers ruffling as it squawked once more. "Give me a cracker. Ya blasted blighter." The crew burst into laughter, the tension of the eerie moment shattered by the bird's unexpected outburst. Even Idris couldn't help but crack a smile, though his eyes still held a trace of suspicion as he regarded the parrot. "Well, that's one way to break the mood," Yarrick chuckled, wiping his eyes. "Looks like we've got a demanding guest tonight." Idris raised an eyebrow, still holding the bird on his arm as it bobbed its head, clearly pleased with itself. "A blighter, huh?" he said, amused. "If you weren't so colorful, I might take offense." The parrot screeched again, then fluttered off his arm, landing near the fire as it paced back and forth like it owned the camp. "Cracker. Meow." It squawked while eyeing them expectantly. Ilara smirked, tossing a small piece of bread towards it. "Closest thing to a cracker you'll get." The parrot snatched it up greedily, making odd grumbling noises as it ate. The crew, still chuckling, returned to their tasks, though Idris's thoughts lingered on the bird. Beneath its comic demands, he could still feel that strange, unsettling intelligence. As night began to fall, Idris raked the last of the firewood into the flames, the embers crackling softly in the quiet. The crew had settled in, their exhaustion palpable after the long day's march. He scanned the camp, watching as the last of the crew members unpacked their bedrolls. "We need someone on watch tonight," Idris said quietly, his gaze falling on Yarrick, who was lounging near the fire, half asleep already. Yarrick groaned, rubbing his eyes. "You think something's gonna happen? We're clear of the blight and that bird." He jerked a thumb toward the parrot, who sat perched on a rock, eyeing them with curious eyes. "Seems more talk than threat." Idris gave him a wry smile. "The bird, no. The rest of the island, maybe. It's too quiet for my liking." Ilara, seated by the fire sharpening her blade, chimed in. "I'll take the first watch. Not much use sleeping with that thing squawking in my dreams anyway." The parrot cocked its head as if understanding, letting out a low whistle in response. Idris glanced at it again, still unsettled by its presence, but he pushed the thought aside. "All right, Ilara, wake some of the others when you're done." "Lovely," Yarrick muttered, pulling his blanket over his head. "Wake me if that bird starts asking for a bed." Ilara smirked, her hand resting on the hilt of her blade. "Just try not to sleep too deeply, Yarrick. Who knows what that parrot will do if we're not watching." Idris chuckled, but his mind was already elsewhere. Something about the night felt heavy, like it was pressing in around them. He stared at the bird once more before lying back against the rock. "Keep your eyes open," he added quietly to Ilara. "Something doesn't feel right." Ilara nodded, standing watch with her back to the fire, her eyes scanning the landscape. Soon, the quiet sounds of the camp settling into uneasy rest surrounded her, the crackle of the fire blending with the night's whisper. And then, as he slowly drifted off to sleep, Idris started to dream. The earth trembled. He saw chasms splitting the ground, jagged and endless, swallowing the land whole, and from it emerged monstrous roots and twisted wood, like the fiends they'd encountered earlier. Yet across these gaping wounds in the earth, bridges appeared, crafted from beams of impossibly strong wood, held together by a force not of this world. The wood gleamed under an eerie, otherworldly light, unnatural in its perfection. And there, standing at the center of these dream bridges, was the parrot, its feathers resplendent in greens and blues, yet now it wore a crown upon its head. The crown, made of twisted gold and shimmering gems, pulsed with a faint glow, casting the bird in an aura of quiet power. Its eyes gleamed with that same unsettling intelligence, and its voice echoed through the dreams, "Give me crackers."